Hello, so I'm Po. I'll be taking the moderator role on this panel, and I just want to make sure that we have every panelist here. So I see myself, I see Carolyn, and I'm just trying to make sure. May I ask the organizers, do you have some standard way to highlight the speakers, or it's just here in the gallery view? Oh, I see. Well, I see all of our panelists. We're good. Okay. Well, in that case, let's go ahead and get started. So one of the interesting things whenever you change the format, so for example, online education is a different format than in person, is that there might be some benefits and there might be some non-benefits, disadvantages. Anyone want to comment on what you see as some of the large, significant advantages and or disadvantages of the different formats? Just jump in.
Well, one thing I think that it's important to keep in mind really is that our recent experience with online education wasn't a typical one. We've been thinking about the trade-offs between online and face-to-face education for a long time. And there have been a lot of financial pressures that have pushed to scaling up and doing more and more online, but that was planned online. We've also, thought about, can we do it free? Or how much does it really cost? What are the cost benefit trade-offs? But this past year has really been a challenge because of the emergency move to online. But I think that there are ways in which it's actually taught us some new things about how to do online better. But at the same time, I think there have been major societal downsides that now we have to deal with in the aftermath of the pandemic.
Yeah, and at Agora, we have supported many edtech companies to launch online learning platforms, and I've seen many benefits of doing online learning. Major benefits include like flexibility, affordability, and also accessibility of knowledge. For example, flexibility. I'm seeing like online learning is not restricted by geographic boundaries, and students can attend classes from any location of their choice, and it saves their time since they don't need to commute from where they live to classroom. And either through self-paced learning or on-demand live tutoring sessions, online learning offers more flexibility in terms of like scheduling, so students can learn at any time of their comfort, right? So the second benefit is affordability, and especially compared to in-person learning, online learning definitely can reduce financial costs since there's no real estate or physical space needed. And besides, all the courses and also like study materials are in digital form, and these paperless option is more affordable and also beneficial to the environment, right? So the last point is accessibility. And as we all know, like experience in high caliber educators is a scarce resource. So what online learning platform can do is to maximize the reach of these educators and let their instruction and guidance benefit more students. So one example is VIP Kid, one of the edtech unicorns based in China and also one of our customers. And they achieved a great success as a platform with 100,000 teachers, and they host 5 million of classes every month. So what they do is they provide a one-on-one language learning platform and connect Chinese K-12 students with US-based language tutors. And through their online platform, language learners can directly talk to a native speaker and converse in an immersive language environment, even if they are 1,000 miles away from each other. So I think that's the major benefits that online learning can offer, like in terms of like affordability, accessibility, and also brings students together and also like connect them to valuable and quality education resources.
And I would just add on to that, two of the benefits that I've seen a lot of is access to experts that you wouldn't have in your local community. So particularly folks in the same time zone, but up and down the entire globe, where access is easy because you're internet connected and you're on the same sleep cycle. You just couldn't have gotten that before. And then second, opening up access to teachers who want to be teachers but don't want to do it as a full-time job for any number of reasons. Either it's not their full-time passion or it doesn't pay what they need or what they want. And so online, because of the low friction of joining and finding someone who's really excited about learning, attracts people that teach for a passion, and those tend to be the best teachers in a lot of contexts, especially for adults.
Right. So I want to say as a moderator, go on, Carolyn, do you have something?
Yeah, I just wanted to offer a little bit of a counterpoint because I think we focused a lot on the advantages, and I think all of these advantages are real and they're great. But there are some caveats that we have to keep in mind, and that is that these benefits, they are not accessible universally to students. So there is a not universally good enough internet infrastructure for everyone to benefit from these resources equally. Also, students have needs for support beyond just the delivery of the instructional materials. So these online learning resources are in some ways a big disadvantage to students who need more support in terms of regulating their learning trajectories. You know, they might just need somebody to pay more attention to them. They might need more interaction with other students. And these kinds of experiences may be less accessible online unless an intentional effort is made to provide those things. But that isn't always done. And so many students do suffer, and we need to keep in mind that we have to build in the support that's needed for that learning to be successful.
One of the things I always encourage people to do is consider, exactly to that point, whether the limits in today's online education world are fundamental and just are going to be there forever, or whether they're temporary and can be overcome. So in the absolute worst case scenario, and absolute most needy situations, when you think about how a suicide hotline here in the US has been created, and I know that's an unusual comparison to make to education, but when suicide hotlines became a phenomenon, or support groups became a phenomenon, of course there's in-person models for that, but the most high leverage, the fastest and most reliable and best access way to do it was to have a phone call. And in the US, when you go to places, there are phones installed in public places that are hotwired to support hotlines to prevent self-harm. And that is an area where online, the disadvantages of not being universally accessible were overcomable, versus, of course, if you're talking about, let's say, child education for 7-year-olds, there's a lot of tactile and tactical and physical expression or just interaction that's required, and that kind of education probably will never get there online. You can't do it with a VR goggle. I can't fathom how to overcome building blocks and emotion in the same exact way as done in person. It would be a very different learning experience for that child. So overcomable problems and non-overcomable problems, and it's a big delineation when I think about the future of innovation in online ed, and it builds exactly on what Carolyn's saying.
And it's interesting that you bring up the point about suicide hotlines when we think about news reports over the past year of especially young people, how hard hit in terms of their mental health they have been because of the isolation. It just highlights the need that humans have for interaction with other humans. And so as we think about, I think that we had a lot of naive ideas as just a whole world society benefiting from high tech, and thinking about what we could do with online education. And even in the 80s, people were talking like, why don't we just move all of education online? Why do we need a campus experience? But I think we see how much community matters, how much human contact matters, how much interaction matters.
Yeah, I want to emphasize, I'm actually going to be asking a lot of questions here, which indeed, I like what Carolyn said of we can't only say good things. In fact, I'm sort of trying to aim these questions at things that are the difficult underbelly, because that's actually what is difficult about starting an online education business. Again, I'll say I speak at this as somebody who does run online courses. I have an online school, and we also have an online website. So of course, I think that the online education brings a lot of benefits. But at the same time, I'm trying to run this panel in a way where we don't give all of the attendees this rosy picture and everyone says, I'll start an ed tech company, and then they find all the problems that we've run into. You know what I mean? So basically, I'm asking these questions as a person who is seeing them. And of course, I have thoughts of my own answers too. But the next one I'm going to ask is one of the trickiest questions. We have 78 participants on this Zoom call right now. What % do you think are actually paying attention?
third.
That's a good question. Let's create a poll and to ask their response. How many actually pay attention to our speech?
So honestly, I don't know how to use that because I don't use this. Does anyone know how to use the poll feature? So I am a host. I should be able to do something. It says if you're allowed to invest in either. I actually
I know how to do it, but-
easier way. I have an easier way. Poll is too sophisticated. To me, I just use reactions, right? Let's just say if you're actually paying attention right now, just raise your hand.
Hands.
Just raise hand. There's a button to raise hand. Let's see how many people raise their hand. It totals it
That's
for us.
great.
Not that many.
So now here's an interesting question, right? So right now we're seeing, and the interesting thing is, I'm just going to leave this up for a few minutes. Oh, well, we can see it. We saw it peaked at around 16-ish. Everyone's putting their hands down or it's timing out. All right. Now what do you think we should do about this?
Well, the first question is it a problem?
Ah.
Is that a problem? I mean, I'm in New York State talking with you all, and everyone here is in at least 14 different time zones. So what problem are we solving, first of all?
Well, I mean, I'm asking about the 78 real-time participants. These are people who actually are logged in right now, as opposed to the ones who are going to watch the webinar either on YouTube or the recording afterwards. So there are 78 people who actually showed up to watch this right now.
So the 2/3 of people that let's just assume aren't paying attention, the problem is that they are not paying attention.
Yeah.
So, I mean, so personally, I think at a panel like this, if there are people who are logged in and they're not, they're checking their mail or whatever, that's their prerogative, right? But I do think in terms of online education, we do need to seriously think about how to engage students. And it's been really, really important to instructors at Carnegie Mellon this year, and I'm sure everywhere, but I just am more aware of what's happening locally, to work together to find ways of actively engaging our students so that we don't lose them. What I know from research on massive open online courses, once you lose students, they're gone, and so you really have to, from the beginning, you be proactive in creating those interactive experiences for students. So even in my course, which has 100 or more students in it, which sounds small in comparison to some of these online courses, but I think is still a lot to manage in a Zoom session. I really have spent an awful lot of time thinking about how to make those active sessions. But then I think that in some ways they became more valuable than the face-to-face lectures, because students came, they brought their software, we worked together, they could ask questions while they were working. It was like a giant office hour session, but nobody was in the back. And so I think that if we're intentional, we can keep people engaged, but we have to think it's not just about, spouting out information.
Yeah, but great. And this is like a phenomenon we've also seen like in K-12, like school system as well, especially if we look at data, for example, like the students' grade in these academic year, for example, like fall 2020, right? So there are more like students with Fs and Ds, and actually they are failing the distance learning. And teachers like grapple with this failing grade, and many disengaged students that simply didn't show up during the class. And this is a problem I've already identified in the like existing world. So what I've been seeing, some of the solutions, those who are providing after-school tutoring sessions. The way of their doing that is they create a smaller classroom online type of learning, and they engage students with group discussion and also like group projects that keep them engaged all the time and ask them to speak, to express themselves, and to answer questions very often. And also like teachers will be able to provide personalized guidance to each of the students, since the class size is very small. So they can have like personal attentiveness to each of these students. So I believe, although compared to like in person, like physical, like learning, online learning has some limitations, but I believe there are ways to leverage some of the student engagement tools, for example, like formative assessment, and also group work, discussion, and to engage students and let them participate inside of this classroom.
Yeah, along the lines of engagement, right? So here's a question that has been debated quite a lot in, let's say, American public school system. But I'm just curious what our thoughts are on what can be used, I guess what an answer might be if we're focusing on engagement from, let's say now we're doing more these private companies which are trying to do online education. And that topic is around students turning on their cameras. So for example, in order to facilitate this engagement, one way that this is done is if you have a one-on-one video chat. I think you mentioned VIP Kid. I assume most of them have the camera on as they're using it because the teacher is interacting directly with the student. And Lance, you also mentioned these small groups. And presumably in a small group, one expects that there's camera feed from student. But some of us also have noticed as we teach at our universities that the vast majority of people are a black square with a rectangle with a white word on it. Do people have thoughts on how important that reverse video feed is from the student to the instructor or manager?
So personally, I bucked the trend on that one. I did not require my students to turn their video on, but I can tell how many students are actively engaged because I use polls and activities that require them to give input very frequently. And so I know how many students are with me and I don't need to see their faces. And actually many of the students are coming from places where their internet is not that great. And so they are actually better off turning their video off because it saves bandwidth.
Great. So continuing on this. So I mean, definitely that's true, right? So now if I want to dig a little bit more on that question. In some sense, I guess one of our goals in educating is to educate the people who are interested. But in another sense, our goal is also to educate the ones who are not engaged, which is to re-engage people who are already drifted out. Actually, that lets me address the first question raised by an anonymous attendee of how do you think we can re-engage students or audience that kind of drifted out? Because in person, you see the person drifted out and you attempt to look at them and establish eye contact or something. Any thoughts on how this is done in the online environment?
So I'll highlight again that I really think that it's a losing battle. Like if they become disengaged, it's very hard to bring them back in. But I did notice last spring that some students, I think because they were in shock with everything that was going on, there were some students that slipped. And I had to keep an eye on any indicators that would tell me that was happening. And then I reached out with personal emails to each one of those students, and they really appreciated it. I think that we need to have these indicators. So we need to build in ways that we can monitor what's happening with our students. One easy way is just to make sure they're turning in their assignments, but there can be things that are happening in real time as well. So, and here's another question: even face to face, if it's a big class, how many of the students do we know are actually paying attention then either? So, but I think that there's a lot of work that's going on now, innovative technology to try to gauge what's going on. I want to highlight the work of Amy Ogan here in CMU's HCII, who's working on technology for processing video in real time in classrooms to see who is engaged and how the interaction between the class and the teachers is going. We've done work like that, monitoring collaboration in real time. Both in chat and now in multimodal, being able to see how our students interacting with each other, and then using conversational agents, sometimes on a screen as a virtual human, to kind of do the facilitation and to keep things going. And I think there's still a lot of room there for technology to do that monitoring, to look for kinds of events that show that there is a problem that needs to be addressed, and work on how to address those. So in the particular research that my group does, we are working on interventions for kind of stimulating interaction in small groups. But I think there are, outside of my research expertise, definitely lots of situations where students are not working in small groups and nevertheless need the support.
Another way to ask the question around, so I think in small group seminars where every participant could speak at a reasonable amount of time and everyone else could listen, and it would be and the size of the group is, call it 10 or in the range, that probably isn't quite the problem area around turning off video. It's like any meeting where you want to be respectful of everybody because you know how small the group is. In a large lecture scenario, online or in person, I think you have to ask the question of, is that the fastest or best mode of delivery, and for how many of those students? And so online creates new ways to flip that classroom. So can you provide asynchronous content and in a way celebrate the watching of a video at the student's time, sort of like binging on Netflix? Can you promote that to replace the lecture, and then use the in-person live synchronous time to engage in a deeper discussion about the content? And obviously that's a hand-wavy answer to the question of how do you re-engage students, but I generally like to encourage larger rethinks as a result of the moving online. If you think of COVID as accelerating, just like throwing people off a cliff into online and how painful it is to jump off or to be thrown off a cliff, that's kind of what we've gone through. But now that we can see how many people can do online, the question is, how do we do it extraordinarily well in the coming decade?
So
Carolyn's nodding her head, so I'll stop there before I say anything. That
I really like what you said, and at this point, I'm maybe going to say a little bit about what we do also, because in some sense, I also have been wrestling with this question, and I'm saying this because I think it might trigger a discussion. So this exact question of, should we just be porting what works offline and making an online version of that? In some sense, Daryl is saying the answer is no. The whole point of online education is you have a different infrastructure. And so maybe we should just rethink it. Why are we doing a large lecture anyway? Only because that one professor is only available at this time. So go stick 200 people in the room. And so, for example, what we do, we have an online course series called the Daily Challenge. And it's called the Daily Challenge with Poshan, though, because I'm the teacher. But the way this works is we teach mathematics, and we take the way people usually learn mathematics and we turn it upside down, where instead of watching the teacher do a method and you practicing 20 of them, every single lesson consists of the teacher, sort of like a game show host, pitching a question that we know you don't know how to do. Try this. You don't know how to do it. And then you think about it. A minute later, a hint pops on the screen. Think about it another minute. Then another bigger hint appears on the screen. Then you keep thinking about it. And by the end of this 3-minute period, which has 2 hints in the middle, there's a decent chance that even though you didn't know how to solve it at the beginning, you sort of know now. And then of course, you interactively hit something to answer the question. And then there's a discussion, well, still pre-recorded and delivered asynchronously, where every 3 minutes, there's some questions to make sure that you understand what's going on. But at the very least, the entire principle of this learning content has been where you, the student, are actively trying to figure something out, actively, not passively watching someone and then mirroring it. So I'm giving this as one example of what we do, but I'm looking to see other people have other fun stories of a trick they did to actually specifically use the online to deliver something that was impossible in the offline setting, where you suddenly end up delivering a modality which is useful, but couldn't have been gotten before. And then you don't even bother with that large lecture because it's irrelevant.
Actually, what I'd like to do is just highlight the extent to which the design that you used is what the research literature in learning sciences would advocate for. It's about progressive hinting. It's about the scaffolding that we need. It's immediate feedback. With the assumption that because they didn't know how to do it, even if you had been monitoring them, that's what you would have known. But so something like, say, a cognitive tutor behaves very much like these activities that Poshan was talking about, where students come and they're solving problems and they make an attempt. And if they make a mistake, it immediately gives them feedback. And then there's kind of a progression of hints. And we know that works. It works very well. And you can see you can simulate that idea in the online context. And I think that what that points out is that there is a lot that's known from the literature and learning sciences, from people who study how people learn, that can be adapted into instructional design that allows us to make use of this online space. And one thing that we saw during the pandemic is that there was, massive terror among instructors that suddenly had to do things differently, but not enough interaction between those who were designing the materials and the research literature that exists. And I think now we see that, and even as researchers, we are very aware that we need to do more to create that conversation. And there are efforts now to try to get more of a partnership so that, if there is another emergency shift to online, or as Koshen has pointed out, if we continue this trend, that there will be more interaction between communities where it would be very productive.
Yeah, another example or use case where I've seen widely adopted in Chinese after-school tutoring companies is they also host very large-scale classroom where there are even hundreds of students attending at the same time. And what they do is divide these students in subgroups, leveraging like breakout rooms features inside of like video conferencing tools. And actually these allows, and they will assign actually a teaching assistant or facilitators inside of each small classroom, where their responsibility is to engage students with activities, as Professor Low and Rose mentioned previous, either through like group chatting, like actively solving a problem, or to debate, and to host any like very engaging activity inside of each small group, while there will be a more experienced teachers like hosting the larger session, where that person's responsibility is more towards delivering the content, delivering the instruction. And these sort of like dividing the labor and specify the labor between different roles inside of a classroom, make these like learning and teaching more efficient, and also like engaging students even in a large scale.
I absolutely agree with that. There's two trends. The first one I was going to say is class sizes right now, a lot of times our lectures especially, they're not big enough to allow that kind of subgroups, or they're not small enough to allow everyone to contribute. And that middle ground is a bad place to be in an online context. So the solution that we tried at Thinkful, that we worked with at the years of Thinkful and still being invested in pretty heavily, is you allow a larger and larger group, but then the economics allow for those exact subgroups and allow them almost all the time, so a student can engage at their schedule any time of the day or the week, and that takes advantage of one of the fundamental principles of online. So you don't do, instead of you have to be there Thursday at 2 p.m., it's anytime between 8 and 6, 7 days a week, almost like customer support. And the student has so much more flexibility because the class size of lecture is 5x in size. But that middle ground doesn't really work. The other one, and there's two companies I like that are doing great work in this area that I follow for some of the most innovative thinking in the private sector, is Lead Edge Pathways and Edge Pathways, I take it back, and Outlier. And they're both putting very high quality content available, starting from a purely online context in a traditional accredited system. In Outlier's case, a far lower price point to start out. And they're focused on a very specific part of the world. It's not a panacea. So one of the, and you can call it a disadvantage, is obviously some students just will never show up to small group lectures if they're not forced, if it's not on their calendar, they need the accountability. At the minimum, it allows you to identify who those are far earlier. And then it allows you to tailor outreach or just engagement mechanics for that 30% of students who are not going to show up on their own volition. And that becomes also economically viable because you can focus only on the 30% that need it rather than having to work across the broad spectrum of everybody.
Ooh, I want to go off on something that you have said, which is about the economics, which has always been very interesting to me. In some sense, I'm going to pose a controversial sounding question, which is the whole point of this thing. That's my job as the moderator, to kind of poke.
I don't have controversy yet, I think.
Oh, okay. Well, let's hit this one, right?
Dial it up.
If you are thinking about what people are paying for, right? Because if you're going to run a business, you need people to pay you for it, right? And if I want to look at education, I'm actually going to break it into 3 pieces, which this is oversimplification, but these 3 pieces you can feel as quite distinctive. The first one is the content somehow, something that would actually cause you to learn. Another one is the credential that comes after it, proving that you have that capability. And the third one is the encouragement to make you keep on doing it. So I'm actually breaking these apart because I've sort of seen, again, because I do education work both in the US and in China, actually the word "fu" service is a key part of like what people are paying for, right? So I'm actually a little bit curious in this economics of it. how much do you think people are like what willingness to pay do you see for the part called us doing the teaching, the actual person teaching, the service provided by maybe not the teacher, but just to make sure that people keep learning. But you might not need a PhD or even a bachelor's degree for that, for goodness sakes. And then this credentialing part. Basically, okay, I'm already kind of making the question a little bit slanted in the sense that, in some sense, my part gets pirated. and then it's free, so I'm useless. Or is that true?
Definitely don't think it's you that you're useless. But I do think that in the awareness of the customer, they're more aware of who's teaching and the credential. And so those are the things that I think people are willing to put up money for, even though in the end, it's the part that keeps people engaged, that without that, it just doesn't work. On the other hand, I think sometimes companies benefit from the fact that people will pay a lot of money and then drop out because they at least got their money, So, there's that too. But I think that we need to make people more aware of what they need in order to learn effectively. And I would like to see an economy in which companies are rewarded for people coming out on the other side, having learned something and being able to do something with it. I think it would be good for everybody on both sides.
In the U.S. education, in the U.S. higher education system, there's a funny arbitrage that's extraordinarily slow. I think it's funny arbitrage that's been extraordinarily slow to combine, which is 86% or so of college students, average age 26, so very different than the stereotype. 86% of college students go to college to get a better job. They are not there. The learning is the requirement along the way to getting the better job. And that's just the way it is. And that's a big change over the last 50 years. Now, college and higher ed and the degree programs and the accreditation systems and a lot of the professors, not everybody, but all those systems are built around classroom hours. And if the person is going for a job and the classroom hours is the path, it's this very legacy combination where, why do I need to spend all these hours if I can prove that I am more advanced in some of these skills? I should be able to advance ahead. And so the arbitrage is in the favor of the accredited schools. And it creates this problem that you're identifying. Well, which one are they really paying for? Well, they're not really paying for, the way I think about it is they're paying for the job, and you can call that the degree, but the degree needs credibility. And so how do you get credibility? Well, we have yet to really reinvent the credibility system underneath that degree. And we're still using these classroom hours model. And so until that, and you start to see the changes there, a lot of different ways, but until that changes, you're going to still have this funny breakdown of like, well, which one are you really getting? And what is my value as a teacher? And is it the community, or is it the network, or is it the credibility of the school, or is it the degree that they got? And it's all those things, but it's that classroom hours dynamic is making a funny, it needs to be more quickly replaced by a skills-based dynamic when the student is going for a very skills-based outcome, which is getting a better job.
Yeah, I think, Professor Low, your question is more towards how to monetize and whether it is to monetize the content versus credential and versus encouragement. And to answer that question, I'm thinking about we need to look, break down the education industry into different segments. For example, like in terms like Thinkful and also Daryl's mentioned, for credential, it more applies to post-secondary students where they need to reskill or upskill, and they need to be offered a viable career pathway where we can lead them to a viable job that can pay off their tuition fees, right? So that's when credentials is of vital importance to these students. And in terms of like K-12, I think encouragement is also important, and that's where we see a lot of like after-school tutoring companies emerging and also thriving, is because especially in China, where parents need to inspire their kids to study. They want to see that their students actually be interested in learning new knowledges, and wherever the students encounter problem that can be addressed by inside of a school system, there is a tutor that can provide help to their kids. And that's sort of like encouragement or personal guidance is of vital importance to these K-12 students, since they have no need of any credentials. Making them fall in love into learning is more important in this scenario. And for content, I believe that applies to many like adult learners. For example, we see a thriving business of Duolingo's, these sort of like a language learning platform where especially during the COVID, people want to learn a new language and upskill. So that's where like content is more important, that creating an immersive language learning and culture awareness sort of like activities and knowledge. So I think in different use case and different like sectors, different like factors where the ultimate goals will be different, depends on students' need.
How widely available in the Chinese market is a tutoring option, and how much wealth do you need to have in order to have access to that? Obviously in the US you have it, but it's extraordinarily expensive for the average for most Americans. I'm curious how that compares.
Yeah, sure. So if we look at the public companies inside of China and also US, we do a comparison, you will see a lot of like top tier, the largest ones in China are providing K-12 after school tutoring. For example, Tao Education with a market cap around 40 billion. And also New Oriental, one of the largest in terms of like student enrollment as well. So, but in the US, we are seeing sort of like to use publishers, these and also a lot of like edtech unicorns are in post-secondary studies offering like career pathways to students. So these are the different dynamic of two market. So and it's because of the Chinese culture and also the sheer volume of students that make K-12 after school tutoring such a viable business. And in the US, we've already seen like the standard test being de-emphasized. There's a lot of debate going on over there. So after school tutoring might not be that a hot topic compared to what's happening in China. So that's the difference between these two markets. And if you are seeing like the willingness to pay for this sort of like after school tutoring service, like Chinese, the culture, and if we deep down into the data, we can also find that a larger portion of household incomes will be allocated to students' education instead of what's happening in the US. So that's how like why Chinese can like sort of like there are a lot of edtech companies, after school tutoring providers, giants born in China.
Oh,
what percentage? Do you have a sense of what percentage of K-12 equivalent age students in China are receiving tutoring in that model?
I don't have those data, but especially in the during COVID, the market penetration is very high. Traditionally, for example, there is no very low adoption instead of rural areas in China to do online learning, especially for tier 3 and tier 4 cities. But during COVID, where like giants and also like IT companies are offering many courses for free, they are massively adopted and penetrated into those areas. So we see, dynamic changed a lot in China.
Yeah, I was just going to comment that, at least from my observation, I think that, so I used to actually go between US and China every 2 months on this topic of education. And one thing that I noticed that was quite interesting, that I think drives a lot of the market in China, is the Xiaoshenchu, the exam at the end of the elementary school that decides which middle school you go into, which has no analog in the United States. Yeah. And so I'm a little bit curious then, because we're talking about like how much money the household is spending on education. Just to help the audience here, which is international, both people in China and also in the US. My understanding is that in China, the university is a lot less expensive than the US university. And therefore, if you try to add up the total amount of money spent on education over a person's lifetime, if you don't have the big chunk, if you don't have this big chunk of university, you can front load the whole thing to get into this early exam that you need to get into a better middle school. I'm a little bit curious. Do you have an estimate of how much money is spent on this kind of education over a kid's lifetime, including the university, for the typical person in China? because that will help the audience who is not from China compare to what the typical family actually ends up spending on education per kid in the US, given our university tuition.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have that data points, but I do believe that it's sort of like true, and especially like Gaokao, which is the college entrance exam, is very important. And although there's a lot of debate nowadays in China, but the success of that particular exam, like, has a huge influence on the success of a student's career path in the future. While in the US, we've seen like there are alternative ways. You can go to non-degree programs. You can go to boot camps. You can do credential like programs where you learn the necessary skills, and then you can find a decent job. So that's where the system looks different in two countries, and that's where why the after school like tutoring session is booming in China. Still, people need to do test prep, while in the US it's a little bit different story.
Cool. Well, thank you
Is there
very
any
much.
indication in the Chinese market that that's getting more or less powerful for the next generation of learners?
What do you mean? You mean the learners are getting empowered by after school tutoring?
My knowledge is very US focused, so I'm super interested in fixing that. In the US, there's a lot of indications in a lot of different places that the standardized testing frameworks are decaying in importance. But I have no idea what is the equivalent, that middle school entrance and college entrance. Is that staying as important as it always has been, or is it growing, or is it diluting? Do you have any sense of that? If you looked out 10 years, would it be as important in the next 10 or 20 years as it is now?
I think just to provide context for the non-Chinese audience, might even be
Thank
helpful
you.
if somebody. No, it might be helpful. It might be helpful if somebody explains the concept of nature, which is actually a hot topic right now.
Try that, Professor. Yeah. So I think one of the things that that sort of can differentiate a student in China is to whether you've earned a degree from prestigious universities, and that speaks a lot for students' efforts, how much efforts he or she can put into study, and whether he or she can behave very good like a company environment later on. And while in the US, I believe it's sort of like different, right? A standard test being a hot debate, whether that really reflect capability of students to demonstrate how well they can perform either in academic world and also in professional work, right? So yeah, there's different notions and cultural difference between these two countries and systems.
I just want to pop in with a different perspective on this. I'm a little bit surprised by this conversation because I think among people who do research in education, it's very controversial whether the impact of standardized testing is a positive thing or a negative thing. Obviously, it's not black and white, but we definitely saw an increase in importance placed on standardized testing during the No Child Left Behind era. And I think that at least among my colleagues, we were mainly seeing that as kind of a really negative thing because of how it sort of really narrowed the focus on certain things and pushed out other things in schools and placed a lot of pressure both on students and on teachers, and in some ways placed blame in where maybe it shouldn't have been placed, and which was counterproductive. And so I think that standardized testing has phases in the United States. I think it's a very different game than I see in China or in India. And I'm aware of those systems because we get a lot of graduate students from China and India. And so I'm talking to them all the time about differences in school systems. And I see upsides and downsides to a lot of differences. I think it's totally unclear what the ideal world is on this front, because we see a lot of different things and we see upsides and downsides to all of them. And so I think we're still trying to figure out what is the best nature of the pressure to both encourage kids to reach their full potential and also for the system itself to regulate what's happening in the most effective way at all levels. But when I was, when my daughter was small, I think that I noticed that in comparison to when I was a child, there was a huge amount more pressure to get students involved from a very early age in a whole range of extra activities, including tutoring, it just at what seemed like ridiculously early ages. And I think depending upon what sector you lived in, you probably reacted to those trends in different ways, and not everybody engaged in those things. But again, I'm not sure that we know the answer to was that positive or negative.
So Carolyn, your comment reminds me of something a colleague once pointed out to me, which is that once you set forth a metric for comparing or deciding an outcome, it becomes a lousy metric. Because then people optimize for that metric as opposed to what they were, you know what I mean? Once the metric tries to measure something, it can't measure it. We could potentially call it a certain kind of uncertainty principle. But yeah, so that's a very good comment. Actually, I want to steer into another direction, which I think we're sort of set up for with all of this discussion about economics, about things that are driven by money. Well, public education, at least in the US, well, not just at least in the US, all around the world, is government provided, free to everybody, or for minimal cost to everybody, for the principle that you want to let everybody, no matter what family they were born into, have great access to be able to fly. Well, now suddenly here we are, including myself, making companies which are selling services to people who choose to pay and have the capacity to pay. How do you see these things working together? Or is there a way that the private work can somehow be scaled to more people through the public channels? Or how else will we address this inequity that's being propagated now?
I'll bet you my guess is the answers in the US and China are extraordinarily different. In the US, perhaps the one biggest common factor is, and I see this a lot among peers, is you provide a service that's expensive to deliver and it costs a lot to the consumer and it works very well for a rich audience, and then it doesn't reach a mass audience. It just can't. It doesn't have people can't afford it. And then basically what happens in that's probably, I'm sure that's common. It's a standard problem. In the US, the trend, the cycle seems to be government funding flows in to provide public support for what is a pillar of the meritocratic society and education at all levels, at all ages. And profit-minded people come in and find the loopholes and exploits and create a system to grow it dramatically, and along the way create some good stuff and a lot of stuff that turns out to be quite bad for students that shouldn't be in those programs in the first place. And so I mean, those are in the US, that's the major cycle. I'd be very curious to know if the same phenomenon happens in China, or if there's something different about the motivational system that keeps it more in check or makes it even worse.
Yeah, but I'm not that familiar with public education in China, but what I've been seeing in the US is there are different models of doing free education via online. For example, like Khan Academy, which is a nonprofit organization that creates videos in topics like computing, mathematics, and economics, and that's tailored for students below 18 years of age. And their offering is very bite-sized knowledge, where the video content is chopped into 5 to 20 minutes, which is very suitable for kids with a shorter attention span compared to adults. And we've seen that business very successful, as it's already attracted around 20 million students per month. And that's before COVID. And during the COVID, they've also seen a surge of user traffic and this sort of things as well. And they are offering all the courses and content for free to K-12 students, right? And that's one way of delivering free educations in the US. The other way is I think a lot of MOOC providers is providing, I like their business model, which is a freemium model. And since most of the content is also free and students only pay for credentials after completing the course. So I think that strikes sort of a balance between like doing social goods and also maintaining a successful business. And that's a win-win solution for both students and to those MOOC platforms. So these are, I think, some of the use cases I've seen in the US that works, offering like free educations.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that, one of the big advantages I think across the Chinese system over the US system is the US public education system is incredibly fragmented. It's fragmented, almost fractally fragmented. So there's federal policy, there's state policy, there's county policy, there's locale policy, there's city policy, there's town policy. And every one of those stakeholders controls some amount of budget, some amount of union support, has needs, wants, and there's superintendents, there's teachers, there's unions. I mean, it's unbelievably layered in terms of complexity. And this is typified. The last time I was in Beijing, there was, I'll just use this superlative, there was an incredible piece of technology related, not similar from Carolyn, the Amy Ogun that you mentioned, but a camera that sits in the front of the classroom looking at the kids and measuring engagement and a couple other factors, right? Do facial recognition on mass. And I looked at it and said, wow, imagine the feedback loop that you get on teacher performance. Of course, noisy because it's not as good as an assessment, but you get it in real time as opposed to quarterly, which is incredible. And that innovation is being driven centrally and can be rolled out in a public school system in a test way and then piloted and grown and whatever. And if you showed up in a US classroom, except for extraordinarily few spots of particularly progressive parents, or not progressive, but particularly minded parents, you would never get support for that kind of thing. The privacy violations, the assessment from teachers, like there'd be unbelievable resistance, and it would take you 20 years to drive out of that, which just doesn't work economically. It doesn't work from an innovation point of view. And so the Chinese system has some enormous advantages over improving public education and harnessing the data that we're not able to collect in the US for, look, without judgment, good reasons, bad reasons, but we just cannot do it here in the US. And it's to our long-term, it's to our detriment. And I honestly don't see in those cases, in a lot of that public education, it just will continue to be slow relative to our competitors or our peers.
Yeah, just a quick comment on that. Oh, sorry, Professor Rose, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna add on in two ways. One of them is, on the one hand, I agree, and there is a huge amount of fear, it seems, among many about the introduction of face recognition into classrooms. But on the other hand, I think that we are all part of a connected world that where we can share insights, and if the work in China that can happen differently than in the United States is properly studied, then we can learn from it, and eventually, perhaps, we will change how we do things here. And it will depend upon what the research says was the impact of having done that. So I agree on the, I think we don't have to feel bad that the United States is different. I think that it's good that there's a diversity around the world of ways that things are managed so that people can learn from each other. But one thing I want to point out on the economic level, where we haven't seemed to focus on the policy level of how money is channeled to schools of different kinds. And as we think about how private and public is working together, a huge concern I have is policy that allows parents of kids who are in private school to channel their income tax away from the public schools and towards the private schools where their kids are going. On the one hand, I can see why some people would find that attractive, but I see the huge downside on the public schools that are losing money because the people that are paying the most income tax are channeling it away from the schools. And I think that it would be to everyone's advantage to think more globally on this level. It's not just, of course we all care about our kids more than anything in the world, but it's not just our kids, so I'm sorry, Lance, please Please go
No,
ahead.
no problem, no problem. Just a quick comment on what Daryl just mentioned, especially the US, the policy is fragmented, and we've seen like different schools where school districts adopting different LMS solutions, and whether to adopt like standard like core curriculum, how to define what's the right way to teach students is different among like school districts, like states. So well, in China, that's things are a little bit different. And since we have a more like centralized system, so what we've seen so far is especially during COVID, uh, like Chinese government can initiate some of the programs where it offers massive amount of like free online courses to students, and it's especially like where they can direct students to a centralized online platform to do all the study. And also they have program where to leverage TV programs to broadcast like live sort of like tutoring courses to students as well. And their response time is very quick. So I believe around like April, there are already like solutions massively rolled out in the whole country to do that. Either through TVs and also online. Well, in the US, I've seen a lot of like scrambles, like teacher want to adapt to how to do like online study and how to find the right resources and content to teach the students. So there is like difference in time like efficiency and it's in time like rollout of like this sort of like beneficial public education program.
Yeah, these conversations about the public education and private companies interfacing sort of brings into the next thing, which is if we think about giving advice to potential entrepreneurs, because my understanding is a lot of people who are watching this are thinking about what they want to be an entrepreneur, and maybe we've scared them away now and said don't touch education. Well, I don't know. I'm not sure. I'll actually say it's a huge opportunity, even though I've been asking these questions that are looking at the underside. But now here's here's an important thing. Suppose that there was an entrepreneur looking to get into online education. There are sort of two big business model strategy types, B2C and B2B, if I want to break it because we've just been talking about, I mean, Daryl, I think you commented about how selling to these public groups has all of these different layers of bureaucracy and whatnot. Or you could run Duolingo, but Duolingo was a free app for a while. And when it's free, you're not really making that much money. So do you have any advice for if you were going to start a company now? Would you go for a B2B or a B2C, and why? And it doesn't have to be exclusive, of course. You could try both, but in some sense, your product will be quite different.
I tend to, well, it's different for different people. And some of the most innovative models here in the US are ones that integrate with the accredited system. And that's both B2I, meaning to the institution, to give it credibility and allow it to integrate into the existing system without being too disruptive. While also creating a B2C model so that they can attract students and deliver directly without having to pay all sorts of middlemen. So it definitely depends. I personally am very partial to direct-to-consumer models, because if you can keep the guardrails around not making a product that is structurally expensive for the buyer, you can innovate in a classic technology way, which is you innovate for a wealthy or experimental parent or adult who's buying, delivering a product that can be offered more inexpensively, and then over time you can offer it. You can offer it inexpensively to the market as well, and you can choose when to make that transition. Whenever you can start in a purely scalable model but provide a high quality product, and the sort of deflationary pressures that we see across all of technology, you can do that. Now, the biggest mistake entrepreneurs entering ed tech from different sectors is assuming that they can drive those prices down over time. And that assumption is basically always wrong. If you've got a product that's expensive to deliver in education, it will stay expensive to deliver forever. You have to start with a product like Duolingo or like open classes online or something, or like a marketplace for small instruction that can be offered at a lot of different price points. And you have to start that way. And then you can pick your target market based on who's experimental and open to it, or who has excess capital to try it out, and then adapt from there.
I'll jump in. So I think I'm going to not answer that question directly, but say what I think entrepreneurs, the message that I really want entrepreneurs to hear. And I think it's that I think what drives business often, especially for new businesses, is that you need to survive somehow. And needing to survive somehow means you really have to front the economic side of all of this. But when it comes to education, it's really important to think of it, maybe even like it's almost like health, maybe it's just as important as health. Think about the impact that what you're doing has on people. And, we've mentioned a lot of times we're talking about online education, we're talking about scale. During the time of the MOOCs, I noticed there was a huge increase in a number of startup companies in the education space because it was a time when you could just make a huge amount of money doing that. But looking around, I also saw a lot of people who some of us researchers like to call snake oil salesmen, people who really were like fronting a very dishonest view of what was possible and what they were able to deliver. And it might work in the short run and you might make a huge amount of money that way, but you have to think about the impact on people. And remember that education it's such an important thing that we've talked about the long-term economic impact it has on the learners, that they're able to learn something, that they're able to get a good job in the future. And we have a huge responsibility in this space to make sure that we front the quality. And in that way, I also just want to say, I think it's really important, and the onus is on people in many sectors to try to make the interaction between research and practice work better, so that the work that's produced can be like what Poshen was pointing out earlier, that was very much grounded in the research literature and learning sciences on how people learn. Let's leverage that literature. Let's get high quality educational materials out there.
I agree with that entirely. Another way to put that is in education, you can't fake it until you make it. In enterprise software, compliance solutions, you can, and in a lot of sectors, you can put people behind something you provide before your technology is ready, or any number. You can sell it and then have it delivered 19 months later. In education, you can't fake it till you make it. There's people's lives at stake, and their future earnings and their future stability, and that you're offering a product to a consumer that by definition doesn't understand fully what they're getting or what they're buying, because they have to learn it. And that is unique in education. Well, it's not 100% unique, but it's very rare in education. I've never seen a company fake it till they make it in a way that doesn't create bad things for the customer in a very bad way. And frankly, if it's accidental, okay, but oftentimes it's immoral, which I think is it's very easy to avoid that problem in education, and it's very easy to fall into that trap if you're not aware of it. The upside of that, just to not be so negative about it, is it's very easy to start in education because you can't fake it till you make it. So you work with one student, and then when you work with one, you work with two, and if the first one succeeds, then you get a third. So you don't have to fake it till you make it in education. Also, that's the upside of that, which is incredibly rare as well.
Yeah, but I agree with Daryl, especially for B2C type of scenario where you can easily scale once you've engaged one student, and you can increase your business after that. And what I've been thinking about is what entrepreneurs in education need to think about is to identify some of the pain points and problem in the education industry, and then provide a viable and effective solutions with a sustainable business model. Like if we think about like B2B type of scenario or opportunities, we have like schools and also like enterprises that can be potential your customers, right? And in school system, it might seem challenging at the first, since many like K-12 schools and also universities, they are on tight budget. They don't have much money to spend on buying new edtech solutions. But another, like on the flip side, and for example, universities, we've seen a lot of like student drop out, and they need to retain these students. And I've seen some of the successful business providing a solution to address that problem. For example, using AI chatbots to engage students and to answer their questions in terms of no matter if through like study or any like financials aspects during attending a university, and actually providing in-time support to students and help them to be successful during their university study. So I think like think of like a business model, whether B2C or B2B is important, but what's more important to identify the right problem and to do to generate a solution that can solve that is also important. Yeah.
Wonderful. Actually, that's also very nice because again, so like a positive comment towards this, if there are any entrepreneurs thinking about whether you want to work on education, the flip side of the thing where, which was expressed, which is what you're doing is sort of like health, it could affect a person's life. That's also a huge benefit because if you think about it from point of view of what you might contribute, you contribute good things. And there's another thing, which is that there's a huge economic value there too, if that's what you're focusing on, because everyone in the world sort of needs this. So I want to make sure that even though I, as the moderator, seem to be asking all these downy questions, there's a reason why I work in it. So now I want to use the remainder of the time to make this thing more open. So it's not just that I get to ask the questions, right? So I see a few questions which are here in the chat. There's the Q&A. Sorry, I'm looking at the Q&A, not the chat. But in the Q&A, there's questions that will appear. And I'm just saying this to the attendees. Feel free to type things into here because I'm going to now prioritize the questions that are in here as opposed to what I'm asking. So for example, here's one that's interesting because we had a bunch of questions on the panel so far where panelists asked, how is it in China? But I clicked on the participant list and I see a lot of Chinese names. So my guess is actually they might be curious what's happening in the US too. So let's take that question. The question says, in China, we can see the way of life. I'm just reading it. We can see the way of life of people living and working where people compete in an aggressive way with each other in order to be more successful. If a standard is set, people will always try to do better. Then they come to online education to learn more. What's happening in the US?
Well, I actually think people want to do better everywhere. But I would say that right now, I think that there's a big move to try to make more opportunities for people in the more disadvantaged layer to be able to move up. And so, and one way that we were working to make that available is to work with community colleges to be able to beef up the extent to which the tracks that they offer to students will get them into jobs that will help them to make more money. And so I'm seeing partnerships between universities like Carnegie Mellon and community colleges to try to work with those instructors to create curricula that are focused on credentials that get people into jobs. So I want to highlight the work of my colleague Majd Saker, who has been teaching cloud computing in Carnegie Mellon for many years, and now has a platform that offers a course on cloud administration that he's now partnering with several different community colleges and with plans to really scale that out. And those courses, they get people into jobs that might even triple their earning potential. And I'm seeing these kinds of partnerships, and I think they're very promising. And in some ways, you know, there are those very motivated people everywhere in every country, and we see them, and they're working hard and they're learning and they're earning even more. But in some ways, what that's doing is creating much more of a separation between those who have and those who have not. And I think that the trend is we need to be focusing, and we're working on increasing our focus on closing that gap and making opportunities for the people who have less awareness of how they can better themselves and make it more possible.
Yeah,
I would agree with that. An example, a lot of those partnerships are just at the beginning, and it's fixing what I mentioned earlier, is to phrase it slightly differently, of the product market fit problem between the traditional college in the US and what the adult learner is looking for, meaning the adult learner wants a job, they want a better job than the one they can get. They don't want to be working as an Uber driver forever. And you see all sorts of partnerships forming, still on the edges, still a huge amount of room left, but Starbucks offering college degrees through partnership with, I've never forgotten the school. Is it ASU or SNHU? And then Guild Education does great work here, and a lot of other factors, a lot of other trends like unbundling of the traditional college into community or tracks that start a little earlier, like Edge Pathways, or replacing the classroom hours with something that's more skills-based. And so certainly you have people working extraordinarily hard. The question for us here in the US, a sort of broad question that pervades our politics as well, is, are we able to return to an era where hard work equals great reward? And the big question is whether that only applies to a small few, and our Gini coefficient is extraordinary, or whether we can extend that down to where it used to be, or providing a lot more opportunity for a lot more people if they put the effort in. And so that's our big question in education. Education is that portal and is seen to be historically that portal. Online education is a great stepping stone to get there. And how do we take advantage of it? That's the big question for entrepreneurs in the space as well.
Yeah, I agree that people in the US are also motivated and to do more in terms of study and improve themselves. And in fact, there's a huge like trend happening in terms of like reskill and upskilling, as Daryl also mentioned. And we've seen in post-secondary, there's a boom in also like boot camps, credential programs, right? Where people need to seek ways to have a better like career path for themselves. And also that happens in adult learners, like picking up a language. And we see a lot of like boom for Duolingo, Babbel, this type of like online language learning platforms as well. So that's not like trend happening only in China. And that's like, I believe, also happening in the US as well. And also besides like post-secondary, if we look at K-12 students, once standard tests are like dedicated or were sort of like canceled, they not be that important, students need to participate in a lot of extra curriculum activities to enrich their like experience and also sort of like resumes, right? So even if there's a no test, no like solving problem type of like test prep like efforts, there are a lot of else to do for students that need to be competitive to their peers. So yeah, I believe this also happening in the US besides China.
Great. If you don't mind, I'm going to continue rolling through these questions just so that we can have as many as we can hit that came from the audience. One of them that came really early was, any suggestion to have students even show their face in Zoom? Do people want to answer this one? Not everyone has to answer, by the way, but at least one of us should answer each one.
That's a very challenging question, I believe. Yeah. So I can provide you a solution from a different angle. So I know some of the school system like leverage D2L, these LMS providers, and to do video assignment where students record what they do, for example, how they solve a mathematical problem, and upload that to a system. And teacher will actually like play the video during the class. So in this way, students don't want to embarrass themselves by doing lousy work and subpar like activities. So they put a lot of efforts into like creating that video, and that in that way they also need to submit the assignment, so they don't shame themselves in front of like other classmates. So there's different ways I believe educators can leverage these sort of like tools or assignment or activities to boost student engagement.
Great. If you don't mind, I'm just going to be going a little bit faster, just because I see so many. Here's another one, which is elite students can have better education resources. So does it mean education is a winner takes it all game?
No, and I've somehow come to terms with, let's say, giving up. Elite students are going to spend, wealthy students are going to spend more on education. Wealthy students are going to spend more on community. They're going to spend more on credentials. The Columbia, Harvard, Yale, Princeton's of the world in the US are gonna stay the elite schools in my lifetime. And in a lot of ways, that's irrelevant to the future of education, and it's especially relevant to the future of online education, because the number of people that those schools impact is so tiny, and it's not going to change. The dynamic is they make money by being exclusive, and that is almost antithetical to it's extraordinarily antithetical to the access that online opens up. And so the really interesting parts of education are the ones where you can reach more people with a more scalable product, where your impact is going to help them, and everything that goes to serve wealthy students is going to remain kind of up there, costing a fortune, and being costing a fortune because it needs to cost a fortune, because otherwise it won't be worth a fortune. And so that world is sort of gone in a sense, in the sense that, yeah, it's fine, we'll let the tax system deal with that layer of that few thousand people of society, whereas actually there's real work to do to bring better instruction and better outcomes to the 99% of people that aren't in that group.
Cool. Since we're tight on time now, I actually just want to give everyone a chance to sum up any thoughts. Do you have any parting thoughts you want to leave with people who are considering possibly doing education, entrepreneurship, US, China, or something else?
Pandemic opened people's eyes to the good and the bad of online education in every different sector. It was all of education moved online at once, and everyone got to experiment. If you think that in, let alone 10 years, think in 3 years, we're going to be sitting here with 4 boxes and 74 people learning, then you really got to work on your level of creativity, because it's no time have we ever exposed so many people to something so dramatically new at this point in the inflection curve, where it works, but there's lots and lots of cracks and lots of things that expose as being wrong. And so I'm extraordinarily optimistic about where access and online and availability and price and low price bring us in, because of online education, and accelerated because of the pandemic. It is one of the true silver linings that we're gonna see in the next few years.
Just to build on that, just very briefly, I think that the numbers say that on average students lost about a year of learning, so I think that in some ways this year of experimentation didn't go well. But I think that there are pockets of innovation and creativity where things went extraordinarily well. And I think what we really need to do now is take advantage of this massive experiment that we did this year. And I really hope that somebody finds a way to pick through, the rubble and find, what are those creative new lessons learned that came out of this. It didn't all come from big studies, but, some very creative teachers out there did great things. Let's find out what was learned.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I believe with every crisis, there is opportunities, right? So especially in the online education space, where a lot of students, teachers have experienced online learning, and many of your customers, especially if you are doing B2C model, are educated to accept a certain degree of online education. So there is opportunities for entrepreneurs to tackle this market. And as we have discussed so far, we have already identified some of the problems, especially in terms of student engagement, right? So entrepreneurs, we can start thinking about how to address these challenges and offer solutions to solve these issues.
Great. And I'll just sum up by saying, even though as the moderator, I was asking these questions, it's actually because I care very much about this subject. I actually do work in it. And in fact, I'll just encourage all of you, anyone who's thinking about it, I think when you think about online education, we suddenly have the power of the computer to connect instantly billions of people, not all at the same time, of course, but you could stitch together people from across the opposite sides of the Pacific Ocean. That's the VIP kid comment that was brought up by Lance earlier. And you also have the capability to use computer algorithms to very rapidly deliver feedback, simulating some angle of what a human being did. That's what Carolyn Rose was commenting about the cognitive tutors. And also at the same time, we have to be thinking about, well, when there are all of these new opportunities, how do you use them all responsibly, right? And so I do encourage anyone here who's thinking about it, obviously, as Daryl pointed out, we haven't solved the problem yet. And well, actually, that's also an opportunity. If the problem is solved, then you don't have, then there's not as much more opportunity to do new things. So I want to emphasize, I do really think that there's a huge opportunity here, and also that a lot can be learned, and especially from this audience, from looking at both sides of the Pacific Ocean. Because as was also commented, different systems have different ways of doing things, but it doesn't mean that either of them is 100% correct either. There's a lot of inertia that happens inside a system. So I do strongly encourage, use your cross-Pacific understanding, find the best of both worlds, and let's see what can be synthesized. Thank you to everyone for coming to this panel.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.